Okay. Welcome to Temple University Japan campus. Um, I'm Robert Dijarik from ICAS. I'd like to thank all of you for coming. Just a few things. One, if you didn't get an invitation directly, give me your business cards, or you can put them in this box and we'll be sure to add you to our list. If you have a mobile phone, put it on vibrate. This is, I think, our last event before Golden Week, right? Yes. But we will return with many other events after Golden Week. So we'll start in 2 minutes because we're in Japan. We're always on time. So thanks. Okay, well, brevity is a sort of wit, so I won't waste my time introducing the speaker because I think you came to hear him rather than me. So I'll just say I'm extremely happy to have Takuji Okubo. He runs Japan Macro Advisors. If you're not on their list and if you don't subscribe to the services, you should, because it provides an excellent analysis of the Japanese economy, and it's very clear, it's very concise, and you can understand it even if you don't have a PhD in economics. So without further ado, the floor is yours, Tak.
Thank you. Here it is. Hello. Well, thanks for a kind introduction. I have one clarification. So the website used to be really open to everybody until like a few months ago. So, so I'm an economist by profession, and as an economist, I'm supposed to follow, the economic theory, even in business. So one of the theory is that you should price your product at the marginal cost. That's one of the, basic economic theory. And as you think about it, all the intellectual property, like a data research, the marginal cost is 0, right? Once you wrote it, well, you used to have to copy them, right? And then copying does cost some money. But nowadays, you can just copy paste or PDF, and it's completely free. So initially, I followed my instinct. So given that whatever I have produced has a 0 marginal cost, so I should serve it at free. And then I did have a different I did have a kind of different way to monetize, what I serve as free. But then business is a cruel world, and just because economic theory says so, it doesn't mean it's true. So a few months ago, we actually started to restrict our website, at least like a data download part. You used to be able to come to our website and download, I would say, one of the most comprehensive macro data set on Japan. Now, unfortunately, for a business reason, I had to restrict it. But then I have a happy news for you. Given that you've been so kind as to come and listen to my presentation, and I see that most of you are academics. So I'd be happy to give you kind of an academic free pass if you come and let me know, or even email me afterward, so that you have one of the best access to important macroeconomic data and analysis from our website. Anyway, so without further ado, I'd like to go into the presentation. So mapping Japan's economic past, present, and future. So this sounds a little grand, but you will see why I put it like this in the presentation. So I think it's actually a good time to reflect on how Japanese economy has performed in the last, say, 2 decades, and also how Japan performed in the last 5 years since so-called Abenomics started. And now that I think I appeared on Bloomberg a few days ago, and then I said, I think there's a like 70% chance that Prime Minister Abe will be gone by the end of the year. So if that projection is true, well, I think it's actually a great time to reflect what Abenomics accomplished, what it hasn't accomplished, and where we go from here. So just about that. So on our website, so I think people, so this is actually one of the things we try to do So you talk about like a foreign popularity or Prime Minister Abe, but if you want to show it in data, sometimes it's very hard because it's you Google popularity or approval rate of Prime Minister Abe, and there's just no time series, So that's actually one of the things Japan Macro Advisor is trying to accomplish, to make kind of relevant data available in public. So, so this is approval rate of Prime Minister Abe, not just from just a single newspaper, but 7 newspapers we track. For example, like Yomiuri and Mainichi reported the polling result today. And given that this is I gave Robert this presentation 2 days ago. So this doesn't include the latest results, but then as I included in the latest result, I actually found that his popularity on average, has fallen to the lowest point since his administration started. So I think there's a kind of saying within Japanese political world that 30% is still the yellow signal. So it has to dip below 30%. But I think Abe government is going there. So I think it's really, I think in like half a year or so, I think we will be talking about the post-mortem of Abenomics. But but let's take the clock back to actually 2 decades ago. So this is where Japan was from economist point of view, and I will explain what this is. So economists tend to care. There are actually two most important things economists, like at least applied economists or macroeconomists care about a country. So that's inflation and growth. Fed has is a mandate. So when Federal Reserve talks about dual mandates, they are talking about growth, or employment and the inflation. And Bank of Japan also has kind of a dual mandates. In its Bank of Japan law, it's supposed to care about the growth and inflation. So that's how economists will kind of picture Japan. So this vertical axis is the inflation. So back in 1987, Japan had 0 inflation. So it was actually a perfect world for a central bank. So central banks talks about price stability as the most important element. And back in 1987, from Bank of Japan's point of view, Bank of Japan was doing a perfect job because it had 0 inflation. The price was completely stable. In terms of growth, Japan was also in a good state. Japan had a positive growth over 2%, and the size of the circle, it also has an economic meaning. It's this circle, the size of the circle represents the size of debt. So the size, it's pretty small. Back in 1987, Japan only had 30% net debt to GDP. Japan's net GDP stands at 130% now, but back in 1987, it was 30%. So I think back in 1987, Japan was one of the least indebted country in the world. So, so what happened between 1987 and 91? Well, I think half of you should remember that we had a bubble. So this was a time that one Harvard professor said Japan as a #1, and the US had considered Japan to be at least an economic rival. So Japan had over 6% growth in 1991, and then inflation was above 2%. And you do see that the circle has shrunk a little. So by 1991, Japan had just 10% debt to GDP. So Japan definitely was one of the least indebted country, but at the time. So that was basically the peak of Japan as economic giant. So unfortunately, that was a bubble. There was a real estate bubble. There was a stock bubble bursting in 1989, and there was a real estate bubble bursting in 1991. So by 1996, deflation started. So as you could see, as early as actually more than 20 years ago. So Japan was already starting to experience negative change in the inflation. And the growth was, growth wasn't negative, but it's starting to side toward left. And then Japan had a financial crisis. And this was actually the time I joined Goldman. I'm sure you have heard, there's an investment bank called Goldman Sachs, and that's where I joined as an economist in 1997. So 1997 is here. And then as soon as I joined, Japan experienced a financial crisis. And that was actually fun for me. I think that really made me love being an economist, because there was so much new phenomenon happening. Like I remember one morning in 1998, I opened the newspaper, and there was a bank in Niigata Prefecture which filed for bankruptcy. And then as a student, as an undergraduate student, I wasn't used to hearing a bank going bankrupt. So, hello, hey. So, by the way, this blue, yellow, red has a meaning. It says here, but then basically when it's blue, it means that Japan's debt is not growing by much. When it's yellow, well, it's growing 3 to 5% per year. When it's red, well, Japan's debt is growing very, very fast. So that's how the colorings are made. And then Japan had a mini IT bubble, but then it didn't really help Japan a lot. And then IT bubble bursted, and this is when, this was kind of a, not the previous peak, but not the latest straw, but then a near latest straw in 2002. So Japan had but this was around 2002, Japan's financial crisis were coming to slow end. Probably back in 2002, maybe Japan didn't really realize it, but then I think Japan's financial crisis, like how the indebtedness of Japanese companies, that was, I think that was coming to end in 2002. And then back at the time, we also had a prime minister called Koizumi, who I tend to appreciate. Some people don't like him. Some other people like him. I'm a liking half. So I think remarkably, I think the policy he tended to follow was actually somewhat similar to the current Abenomics. So monetary easing, especially the weak yen part. But then, I mean, a little different on the fiscal front. But then like emphasizing deregulation. So was somewhat similar to the current Abenomics. And Abe was, his secretary, Kanbo-chokan, Chief Cabinet Secretary. So Japanese economy did well between 2002, 2007. Japan was able to move toward top right part, which is better growth, higher inflation, or at least not deflation and higher growth. And you do see the circle. It's maybe a difficult to see, but the circle has shrunk a little. So Japan was on kind of a recovery path, and but still in deflation. but much smaller deflation than before. And then I think if Japan was if Japan were lucky enough to keep growing up maybe a few more years, I think Japan was able to actually come to the good area of this map, having a positive growth, positive inflation. But unfortunately, the fate didn't allow it. So we had a Lehman shock, we had a subprime crisis, and that really put Japan into the very depth of deflation. And then after that, so Japan did kind of a crawl back toward positive growth, positive inflation. But you do see that was really accompanied by a lot of fiscal spending. So, but as you can see, this, I think what this graph is actually meant to, it's actually designed to be that way, but economy actually tend to go in circle. And that's actually how we kind of named it as a risk typhoon map, because it looked like a typhoon, but gradually growing. And then, so this is when Abenomics started. So back in 2012, this is actually a chart I made back in 2012. But so this was a kind of a simplistic, but then this was basically the aim of Abenomics, higher growth, high inflation, inflation something around 2%. So, but we were talking about, risk. Obviously, there were risks to this positive scenario. One risk, which I don't think too many people talked about in Japan, was risk of excessive inflation. So, there are some people who were worried that Bank of Japan may ease too much, like yen start to fall without, uncontrollably. So, inflation may go up, well above the targeted 2%, and then eventually Bank of Japan may have to tighten and get the economy back down. So, well, fortunately, this didn't happen. Another risk was that, well, this is relatively simplistic, but something happened in the economy, so to put Japan back toward deflation. So what actually happened to the economy? So I think it looked like it was going well for a few years, but then here I think they made a mistake of raising tax. So I think there's a controversy around whether it was right decision or wrong decision to raise consumption tax in 2014. I think it was wrong. I think Governor Kuroda should have argued against it, but he did anyway. So, but I think that really killed off the momentum. So inflation, even without, after excluding the consumption tax effect, Japan disinflated, actually went back to deflation in 2016. But although it's coming, starting to come back here. But overall, after 5 years of really aggressive monetary easing and at least normal fiscal stance, Japan is kind of hasn't really been able to elevate the inflation toward 2%. The latest number is actually 0.5. And so it's difficult to predict the future, but I think policymakers, including the majority of BOJ carry-off shows, I think they don't really believe that the inflation could go up to 2% in 1-2 years' time. I think majority of policymaker start to feel 2% inflation was perhaps an impossible idea, even a bad idea. I think that is actually the sentiment within the majority of government officials. BOJ board is populated more with reflationary minded economists. So BOJ will probably kind of stick to 2% inflation, but I do feel that even Governor Kuroda is actually starting to lose resolve. I think Governor Iwata, who just retired, even said he was, in his mind, he was too simple-minded to feel that 2% inflation can be achieved just by monetary policy. So it doesn't, so it seems that Japan is rather unlikely to be able to come up here. And then if that's the case, well, sooner or later, recession will come. Maybe not this year, but maybe next year. And then Japan could actually be pushed back into the deflation again. So, well, it's difficult to talk about the future, but then so long as Japan kind of dither around here, well, there'll be a recession at some point, and Japan will be put back into deflation in the future. I think that's actually the more likely than somehow Japan being able to push up the inflation. Oh. So, but I do want to talk about the achievement which was made in the last 5 years. I don't love Shinzo Abe. From a political point of view, I actually don't like him. But from economic, as an economic policy, I think there was a few good achievements he made. So as his, this is, Japan has been enjoying a pretty good growth. So this just shows you the quarterly growth rate of Japan. So Japan, for the last 2 years, Japan has consistently grown for every quarter of the last 2 years. And that hasn't happened since the bubble days. I'm sure you have heard, but then, unemployment rate has fallen to 2.4% before rising back to 2.5%, but nevertheless, it's very low. And when you talk about unemployment rate, it's just a percentage, but then when you think about it in terms of a number of people who were unemployed here and then who were employed, you're talking about close to 2 million people. So there are, of course, obviously it's not just Abenomics or whatever, but then, and then you can argue it was just coincidental. But then I think this positive growth did some good to the welfare of Japan. So there's like, more than 1 million happier household. So on that front, I think there were some positive legacy, well, positive achievement Prime Minister Abe did. And well, wage may be starting to finally rise. I mean, it's just 1%, but so if wage start to rise, and while Abe is being kicked out, it will be a little irony there. And so this is like overall wage growth, but then at the kind of a more peripheral labor market, if you look at actually poorer half of a Japanese worker, things are actually getting better relatively more for them. So this looked at the part-time workers. So it's growing, their wages growing close to 2%. And if you take the number for like temp workers, their wage is actually growing at close to 4% now. So at the periphery, so even though like full-time employees with full benefits, their wages are not growing, but then kind of a poorer part of Japanese labor force who do not have these benefits, their wages are actually growing fairly rapidly nowadays. So this is one of the recent finding I did. I recently just published this report last week, but so Japan Inc. is becoming profitable, very profitable, and not just in terms of size, but then in terms of efficiency. So ever since so 1992 to 2012, I think. So for this 21 years, it was only just this 3 years where Japan return on equity has risen above 5%. And but obviously, there are there's improvements, and I think if you have I think this room is more populated with academics, but if you talk to business people, you would say, raising return on equity, corporate efficiency is the most important element, because when you think about it, yes, majority of Japanese workers work in a company, right, rather than government or in academia. So achieving 8% return on equity kind of is a fairly significant achievement. And it was also achieved not just by the economic cycle, but I think there's something fundamentally different going on in the non-manufacturing sector. This is a chart for return on assets. So it's another measure of a corporate efficiency. So, Japan's non-manufacturing sector, like retail, real estate, service sector, I think that sector used to be considered inferior brother. So I think in Japan, manufacturers, car makers, electronics makers, they used to be the envy. Well, there were at least there were a time that they were the envy of global corporations. But then Japanese retails, Japanese real estate industry, Japanese service industry, they used to be considered they are the lesser brother of a Japanese sector. But then nowadays, so this goes back to 1970, but they are actually becoming the most efficient. So I think it's not just Abenomics, but then I think there has been a gradual improvement in corporate governance in Japan, and I think, it's not 100% that, and obviously economy is good, but then I think there's some gradual improvements in the way Japanese companies are being managed. So even fiscal balance, I think typically Prime Minister Abe is being hammered on being fiscally irresponsible. And yes, I think there's actually some truth to that. He hasn't done anything about pension. He hasn't really done much about health industries. Yes, but then I do believe trying to grow out of fiscal deficit or trying to grow out of debt is actually the correct policy, rather than going the way of what Germany preaches. Look at what happened to Greece, Spain, Portugal. Trying to fix your fiscal problem by reducing spending, raising tax. It may sound courageous, but then I think it's a wrong policy from an economic point of view. And well, I think this shows one reason, you see that the growth is actually good for reducing deficit. So I think I will skip that. So in terms of medium term, so Japan has been suffering from 2 decades of deflation. There are some chances that the Japanese economy could actually achieve to eliminate deflation, but then I think Japan need to be in luck for another few years. So maybe Japan could be lucky enough for another couple of years. But then, but if there is a global recession, I think Japan will be really pushed back into a deflation again, with yen like going strengthening to like 80 yen per dollar, because that's actually where yen should be, if not for the aggressive monetary policy. Kind of if you calculate equilibrium kind of fair value for yen, it's actually around 80 yen per dollar. So for people who has a stable job and being paid in yen, that's actually good news. But for Japan as a whole, I think that really risk pushing Japan back into deflation. So a few long-term issues. So I think one of the challenge for Japan is the shrinking population. As you know, but then if you when you say shrinking population, it's very abstract. But then if you put it in a number, like in 2017 alone, there was 0.8 million decline in the work age population. So I should actually come up with a city whose population is as close to 0.8 million. I don't have a good idea, but smaller than Kyoto, so maybe, I don't know, Washington, D.C.? Okay. So basically, yeah, maybe Nagano. Well, I think Nagano might actually have a smaller population than 0.8. I have no idea. Huh? Sendai, okay. So this is basically, so like these years, it's like Japan losing Sendai, full of young, full of able and work eligible population. We are losing that city one every year. So that's how severe Japan's shrinking demographic changes are. So Japan, there's actually some form of immigration in Japan. So this is, so back in 2008, Japan had, I think 0.8 million kind of working foreigners in Japan. So in 2017, it's 1.3, so that's 0.8 million increase. So that's kind of a so Japan was able to actually compensate for a shrinking working population to some extent. But then, it took 9 years at the current pace, where, Japan lost 0.8 million working population in 1 year, and the immigration is compensated by, it's currently taking 9 years. But but this, by perhaps accelerating this trend, Robert is actually one of actually many of you are one of those. So trying to get more of you to work in Japan, I think that's one way to compensate for it. So this is actually one of the last slides. So this is the picture of Japan. This is kind of what Japan was back in 1995. So Japan was by far the giant of Asia. So this circle shows the size of the economy. So, obviously Japan was the elephant in a room. So now this is the picture. So 20 years on, Japan is still big, but it's actually one of the big economy in Asia, which brings both benefits and, I guess, disadvantages. Another way to put where Japan, China, India is so this is the per capita income, well, per capita GDP. And so 2016, China is where Japan was in 1986. And when if those of you who remember how Japan looked in 1986, it is actually very surprising. I mean, it's probably, especially if you haven't gone to China in the last couple of years, it is actually very shocking that the current in China, on average, they're actually as rich as Japan in 1986. But another interesting thing is the current India is actually as rich as China back in 2006. So if you've been to India and if you see that how well not so rich they are, it is actually surprising that China was actually there only 10 years ago. And it does this contrast between India and Japan and China in the middle. I think it really shows how China has grown in the last 10 years. Another way to look at it is I think where India could be if they manage it well in 10 years' time. So if India could manage somewhat similar growth, well, actually, if India managed the same growth as China did, well, India can be the current China in 10 years' time. And even if India screws up, well, maybe give it another 10 more years, and India could be the current China in 20 years. And I think that's actually great news, right? If you are 20 years old or 10 years old in India, well, by the time they get 30, 40 years old, they'll be as rich as current Chinese, and that's actually great news for India. Overall, I do believe this growth is actually positive for Japan. So Japan, I think, Japan will never be tiny, right? I mean, it will always be somewhere, one of the biggest in Asia. So I think it's actually great benefits that India will be growing, Indonesia will be growing, so Japan will be, maybe it hurts if you're a nationalist and if you want Japan to be really on top of Asia, I think this might be a bad news. But then if you're more liberal-minded, the growth of the rest of Asia is actually great. It gives, as you know, that tourists to Japan has more than quadrupled in the last 5 years. And this is a reason. So I think so I think this Japan being one of just one of big country in Asia is actually a good news for Japan, and I think that picture is going to be more and more. So Japan more or less has to live with, and actually Japan needs to think of a way to benefit from being surrounded by eco-level countries. So this concludes my presentation. So thank you very much for your audience.
Thank you very much, Tak. We're very happy that Temple does make a contribution to Japan because we have a lot of foreign faculty who are increasing the labor supply. So the way it works, if you have a question, raise your hand. Tak will recognize you. You can come up to the mic if you want to be recorded. If you don't want to be recorded, you can speak from your seat. So if anybody has a question. Okay, Farah. So.
Hello. Thank you very much for your nice presentation. I'm Farhad from Faculty of Political Science and Economics, Waseda University. So I have two questions and also comments. So you perfectly explained about the challenges that Japanese economy have. However, I would like to hear about the remedies.
Pardon?
About the remedies. Okay. So Prime Minister Abe and Governor Kuroda, they focused a lot on the, expansionary monetary policy.
Sure.
So as you know, the amount of money increased a lot in Japan. So presently the monetary base over GDP in Japan is more than 4 times of the amount of money in the US and in the EU. It is almost 80% of GDP. However, it couldn't create even inflation rate. So the main reason is that the problem of Japanese economy are a structural problem. For example, aging population. You cannot solve the aging population by money or low productive local governance or low productive agricultural sector or low participation of the female in the labor force. So I would like to hear about your remedies for the structural issues that Japan has. This is my first question. And the second question is for the fiscal issue. So you mentioned that you are opposing the Prime Minister Abe's policy for the fiscal matter. So it means increasing the tax and reducing the expenditure was not good. I have one comment. So you compared Japan with Greece. So the reason that Japanese budget and Japanese debt market, the reason that this market was sustainable was because of the demand. It means Japanese debt was sustainable because demand was existing for Japanese government bond. As you know, as everyone knows, 95% of the Japanese JGB, Japanese government bond, is holding by Japanese. And the problem of Greece was that more than 70% of the holder of Greek bond was foreigners, IMF, ECB, German banks. Sorry. But presently, after negative interest policy, negative interest rate policy, this is changing in Japan. So households are no longer keeping JGB because it is not rational, because the yield became negative. Foreigners into this market. So it means that it is necessary to reduce the risk premium and reducing this huge amount of gross debt, which is more than 200%. I would like to hear more about your answer. Thank you.
Okay. So the first question was on monetary policy. So Bank of Japan has printed a lot of cash, 4 times as much as GDP. So will it bring any disadvantage? Does it risk?
Structural remedies.
Structural remedies. Okay, and the second question was on the fiscal policy. So you compared Greece and Japan. Okay, structural remedies. I don't know. Any ideas? Any ideas? Yeah. So I think one mistake, I mean, there's always, ideal state of the world, and there's reality. And I think in the ideal state of the world, I think there could have been a more reform people can feel as structural. And I think one area Japanese government failed was they didn't have this, I think they didn't have a sentiment that Koizumi was able to create. Koizumi had a slogan, no pain, no gain. And he had a lot of good stage for fighting with conservatives, fighting with like old guard of Japan. And I think he succeeded in kind of creating sentiment, expectation that Japan is changing. There's a new Japan emerging out of old Japan. So, but I mean, this is not just a stage, but in monetary policy, one of the most important element with monetary policy is expectation. So you have to somehow make people believe that inflation will go down. Like in case of Brazil, if your intention was to lower inflation, you have to actually persuade everybody that whatever central government is doing will actually lower inflation. So you do have to take policy that economically will lower inflation, but at the same time, it is well established in the academic literature that not just doing the right policy is not good enough. You have to actually demonstrate. You have to make it easy to understand that to the people to the market, to the people, to the company, that the policy government is taking will like lower inflation or or raising inflation, whichever direction you wanted. So I think, in principle, government under Prime Minister Abe, I think they actually took a right policy in itself. Between 2003 to 7, so in the Koizumi period, corporate profit was rising. Corporate profits was rising. At more or less the same similar speed, capital expenditure. So corporate capital spending was actually rising in line or at the same speed as profits. So what it says is companies were actually investing at the same speed as a cash flow. So companies were willing to invest because they were more profitable, they had a better outlook for the future, and they had more cash. What happened between 2012 to now is profits is up, as I explained. Profits is actually up even sharper than the previous time. But then what you have seen is capital expenditure has more or less stayed not stagnant, but then it was definitely not rising as fast. So this was a puzzle. So among economists, we were wondering, why companies are not investing. So, and I guess that really had to do with expectations. So corporate managers, they felt that whatever Prime Minister is doing is just a temporary thing, and there's no structural reform. I think there's actually almost universal consensus among corporate executives that whatever Prime Minister Abe is doing is not structural. If you ask them in public, they would say, yes, 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 they support the government policies, they see that the Prime Minister Abe is trying hard. But then if you ask them, at least if you ask the clever half in private, they would say, no, they're not. No, Prime Minister Abe doesn't want a reform. He just wants to change the constitution. So that was kind of an expectation Japanese company had. Therefore, they didn't invest. So I think so what they should have done in terms of remedies, it's difficult to say because I think that what they did is actually more or less correct. But I think Prime Minister Abe and the government basically failed in convincing Japanese public. I mean, the best way to convince to your wife that you're not going to cheat is you won't cheat. I mean, that's actually one of the important elements. But then, I don't know, once you had an affair, it's very difficult to convince your wife that you're not going to cheat again. So you really demonstrate that you're not cheating. Anyway, so not that I did, but I think, yeah, so I think that part. So, I mean, it's difficult, yeah. I mean, Prime Minister Abe tried to, for example, pass a labor market reform, which let Japanese company fires with a just compensation. It didn't pass the parliament. We can blame that, but then it's difficult, right? I mean, sorry, I didn't answer your second question. Greece? No, yes, Greece defaulting on Greek bond. You said it hurt 80% Europeans, the rest of Europeans, but then Greece suffered a huge rise in unemployment rate, right? I don't know, like rising to 25%, 30%. I think that itself was painful enough. And I think Greece's GDP fell by 30%. So I think that was really painful. So Japan didn't have to do that. Actually, Japan never had to do that in the past 2 decades. So.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you very much for the presentation. Very fascinating information about on the presentation. And I've got 3 questions. The first question is rather technical. In my understanding, the Japanese GDP hasn't grown so much in the past 20 or 30 years.
just 20 years at least. I don't have the exact figure at this moment, but on the at the same time, your figure showed that the Japanese GDP per capita has seen a significant growth, and just wondering what kind of relationship between the two and the statistical data. The second point is the more macro or broader one, which is the just wondering the what kind of impact actually the government policy has had on the course of the economic development in Japan in the past 30 years, because I wasn't very sure from the presentation that to what extent the government policy has really affected the course of the development in Japanese economy in the past 30 years. So just wonder how you assess the impact of the government and the BOJ policy. The last point
the impact on
of the government policy, in the simple, on the central government of Japan, on the course of the economic development in Japan in the past 30 years. The last question is rather simple. Just wondering whether or not the Japan could avoid some catastrophe, i.e. the governmental default in the future, because this is one of the big concerns among the investors in my understanding. So thank you very much.
Okay. Well, the last question, how Japan can avoid default. Well, I mean, Japanese government issues debt in yen, and yen we can print. So then we don't have much debt denominated in non-yen. So in that sense, we don't. I think, I mean, never say never, but then I think it's very highly unlikely that the Japanese government decide to default with So you could say that the yen could become 1,000 yen per dollar, and that's almost like effective default. Maybe that's actually a good thing, because one joke I tell Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Ministry of Finance people is, why don't you let yen weaken to 1,000 yen per dollar? Because Japan has $1 trillion worth of FX reserve, so Japan can actually repay all its debt by its dollar reserve. So, I mean, I think. What would happen if Japan faces? So I think the worst it would happen is actually not a default, but then like a very sharp depreciation in yen. I think there could be like a mini capital flight from Japan, and that might weaken yen. But then I don't know if you might have millions of you might have billions of yen, but I don't. So. I think whoever get hurt by sharp depreciation yen is people who have wealth in yen. So, and I think one way Japan can kind of fix this remedy is just so weaker yen. Maybe kind of it's like a transfer of wealth from old people to younger people, and maybe that's actually a good thing. So. Well, so no default, no like outright default. So the worst is a sharp yen depreciation. But I think Japan can actually stop that. I mean, in the worst case, Japan can put the capital control on movements of financial asset. And I think that would kind of stop the flow in the short term and try to fix the fiscal balance, or try to, but I think if yen like weaken to say 200 yen, maybe 250 yen, I think that will really boost the growth of Japan, and I think that itself would be powerful enough to get the growth back up.
So technically speaking, that could mean the transfer of the value from the ordinary people to the exporting company, right?
Ordinary people, I mean rich Japanese people.
The ordinary people, including rich people.
Yeah.
So the value of the asset is transferred from the the general public to the exporting company, right? Yeah, one possible explanation. Yeah. Okay.
No, but I think the alternative is to, I don't know, suffer stagnation, high unemployment rate, like a lower opportunity for good jobs for younger people. I mean, for younger people, their asset is actually in themselves. So it doesn't, yen depreciation doesn't matter for them. So so I do feel that there is a risk that the yen could weaken a lot, like 200 yen, maybe 250 yen. But I don't think that's going to last. So I don't think there's going to be a mass exodus of like a people. And I think with a very weak yen, I think Japan can actually come back to growth. So I'm not too worried about that. I mean, so long as you can accept the possibility that yen could weaken to, yen could lose half value. So what was your other questions?
The real assessment of the government policy impact on the economic development in the past 30 years.
Right. I think monetary policy mattered a lot. Other economic policy, like these policies preached by METI, I don't think it mattered that much. Yeah. I mean, it matters. It matters. I think, for example, one of the big problem of Japan is actually a heavily regulated labor market. I think if we let the reason like part-time workers' wage is rising is because company know they can actually let these people go. So they feel they can raise wages, and when the bad time hits, they can, well, let them go. The problem for full-time workers is company knows they cannot actually lay them off. So it's, that lies behind the reluctance to raise their wages and actually even hire people. So Japanese companies are willing to hire part-time workers because they know that they can let them go when the bad time hits. But the full-time worker, it's a different story. So yes, so there are important policy Japan can implement, but then overall, I won't blame, bad policy for the Japan's economic problem. I didn't know. Okay, maybe let the younger people speak.
Thank you very much for your incisive presentation. My name is Makoto Ishii, a private citizen who very lucky enough to come across here today. So I have two questions to ask. I think Japan has what it takes to emerge from the so-called long-term economic stagnation for about 20 years. After all, Japan herself is a very powerful technological hub in the world. Japan also has been a beneficiary of, the long-term low interest policies from the viewpoint of stimulating both domestic demand and investment. And she has also been a beneficiary of a massive domestic savings, as well as a diligent labor force that I think can compete against almost any kind of global competitors. But I think that, the mic turned on suddenly.
Yep.
But I have to admit that there are some obstacles that seems to not work in favor of Japanese economy. For example, as you mentioned in your lecture, a very massive load of government debt, an aging working force structure, and personally, an everlasting demand from MOF to raise consumption tax. These impediments could become very harmful to slow down the economic momentum brought by the recent policies taken by Mr. Abe's cabinet. So I would like to ask, maybe this part would follow in what you have been spoken today. Which force do you think would become more prevailing in future trajectory of Japanese economy? The positive one, or perhaps negative one that I've mentioned above? And secondly, as domestic demand accounts for approximately 60% of annual GDP produced in Japan, to what extent do you think that domestic consumption, especially the individual consumption sector, would become a contributor that serve for the restoration of Japanese economy? Thank you.
Okay. Well, first, I don't think Japan actually had a low interest rates, because in economic term, you generally want to talk about real interest rate rather than nominal interest rates. So you do want to look at interest rates in nominal term versus inflation. And Japan actually had a positive real interest even now. Actually, not now. Well, yeah, I mean, Japan has long had a positive, even after Lehman shock, Japan had actually positive real interest rates. US and Europe, also while US and Europe had a negative interest rates in real term because inflation was higher than interest rates. So that's actually one, that's why monetary policy is, that's why raising inflation is important. But so on your first point, low interest rate has helped Japan. I actually don't think so because interest rate wasn't that low in real term. Although there was nothing Bank of Japan, I mean, there was nothing aggressively Bank of Japan could have done about that. In terms of saving, I don't know if yes, Japan had big saving, but I don't think it has actually helped Japan because Japan basically failed to make use of that saving to invest. So I don't think saving has helped much. And most of the saving were put in like low yielding deposits. So actually, so inefficient use of money, capital, was actually one of the problem of Japan. And one of the chart I showed you, like a rising return on equity. So that actually shows that, Japan is actually starting to use its money more efficiently, so which is positive for Japan. And I think you had one more question, but I didn't quite get it.
Should I be back to you?
No, you can tell me now.
So I said that, how much do you think the domestic consumption?
Oh, right. Actually, consumption was actually doing relatively well in the last 2 years. So it wasn't so much export driven, but it was actually domestic consumption driven. Yes, we can say, we could hope that they should have spent more, but then also, I talked about the pessimism of corporate sector, but I do think there's also pessimism in the household sector. I think, I don't know, there are not too many young Japanese people, so I can't really ask, but if I ask general young generation in Japan, are you hopeful for the future? And I think there's actually empirical data on this, but then I think Japanese young generation are one of the most pessimistic generation of the world. So I think, I mean, I can't really blame Japanese consumers for not spending.
I'm quite hopeful for the future.
Yes, but you speak good English, right? You speak good English, you don't have to work in Japan, you can work abroad. Are you Japanese?
Yes.
Okay. Well, I mean, but you are actually in a much better position. Most Japanese don't speak English.
Thank you.
And their real wages falling.
Yeah, I'm Tag Murphy, Emeritus Professor of International Political Economy at the University of Tsukuba. One thing you didn't mention directly in your presentation, which was very interesting, thank you very much, the prospects for Japan's external payments situation. As I understand it, the general consensus is that sometime within the next 10 years, Japan is going to begin running a current account deficit.
Right.
And if I see that was one thing I was going to ask whether you actually agree with that. And if that's the case, simply by the laws of accounting, the international reserves, you mentioned a figure of $1 trillion that will have to be run down. And then, of course, Japan will have to begin importing capital.
No.
Well, how do you cover a current account deficit without importing capital?
By dissaving
Well,
your overseas investment.
No, wait a second. No, just simply by the laws of balance of payments accounting, if you're running a current account deficit, you could do one of two things. You either import capital or you reduce your international reserves.
Yes.
And so if that's once the international, you mentioned there's $1 trillion in international reserves.
But that's official government
Official reserves, and there are additional reserves as well. But I mean, the outlook, if Japan begins importing capital, is that interest rates will have to go up. And that creates a problem for Japan's total debt position. And I would submit that that's the reason why the finance ministry has been so intent on raising taxes, despite the obvious macroeconomic damage that tax hikes cause, which you indicated in your presentation. Could you just comment on that, please?
Okay. Well, so there's an economist called Charles Horioka. I think you know him. So he came up with this idea: Japan is going to run current account deficit soon, and that would be a big problem for Japan. He said that I think in like 80s, and he was actually talking about Japan falling into current account deficit like, I don't know, 10 years ago. Well, it hasn't. So I'm generally skeptic about this.
Yeah, but you said that it was. You agreed with me.
Yeah. So yes, I do believe that the current account. I mean, Japan. I think Japan is actually almost having a trade deficit, kind of a permanent trade deficit. Japan still have actually fairly large current account surplus. I think like more than like 3%. But then I think if oil price goes to like $120 per barrel, I think that will actually put Japan into current account. So yes, current account deficit may happen. But well, Japan has a huge net foreign asset.
Right.
So government's net foreign asset is just only a part of it. And Japan's net foreign asset is actually even growing now. So yes, Japan might start to run deficit, maybe 1%, maybe 2%. But then just because you have a balance turned from like small surplus to small deficit, I don't think that really will change the world. I mean, financial markets are not that stupid. They know what's coming. So I don't buy the argument that just because current account deficit will turn negative in maybe 10 years' time, that will be the end of Japan's fiscal, I don't know, stability.
Okay.
So.
Just from my seat, just briefly, what do econometrics and your analysis tell you about the future of the labor market? You mentioned fall in the working age population, Abenomics policies to try to encourage women to work, larger numbers of immigration, at least you see part-time workers in the shops. How do you add this all up?
I think so. If there's without immigration, I think Japan will face a catastrophic situation. I think there was a number like by 2040, like 1/3, I think a quarter of the Japanese populations will be over the age of 75. I hate IT, but so I would have shown that in chart, but so, and then I think there is a certain number of people with mental difficulty who are over the age of 75, and then like, I don't know, 10% of Japanese population has mental. So I think, I don't think that Japan can actually cope, whatever the robots we introduce. So I think it's just a matter of time. Japan will have to swallow. I mean, I'm happy to swallow, but even like a nationalist end of a Japanese population have to swallow that they actually need foreign help. So, I mean, even Prime Minister Abe, who I consider kind of right-wing, really right-wing, actually right-wing, is actually starting to swallow that. So, I guess these people will have to face the reality, which I think is good. I mean, it might bring some challenges, but okay.
If time allows it, I have a very general question. You showed us the survey on Abe's popularity, and I wondered, as you told us, he was 1 into 7 newspapers, for example, Yomiuri Shimbun, and I wondered what other newspapers do you monitor to compose that kind of graphs, and what other sources do you base your information on, for example, that information that you publish in your webpage?
No, I just picked 7 which are kind of relatively easy to collect and relatively reliable. So I think that include like Yomiuri, Mainichi Asahi, Nikkei, Kyodo, and 2 more like JNN. It's on my webpage. If it's not in the maintenance period, well, anyway. it's Murphy's law, right? Yeah, but if you can give me your name card, I'd be happy to send over the information.
I personally think that one of the causes of Japanese stagnation lies in the banking sector, and I would like to hear from you about the Japanese government policy in the banking sector, and secondly, could you tell us how you incorporate in your analysis about the financial sector or banking sector problem?
Okay. So I have dealt a lot with Japanese banks, and some of them are my clients. But I think in general, Japanese banking sector is one of the least efficient industry. I mean, one of the most protected, and one of the most. And then I think there's actually a causal consequence here, but one of the least efficient industry. I still can't believe there are still more than 100 regional banks. I think banking is really. I think there's a huge economy of scale, as is the case with the financial industry. Like managing 1 trillion yen is almost the same work as managing 100 billion yen. Maybe you need 10 people to manage 1 trillion yen. You need 9 people or 8 people to manage 100 billion yen. So I think financial industry should be enjoying the scale of benefits, and then the fact that there are more than 100 regional banks tells how inefficient they are. So what do I think about supervision? I think they need to regulate it. They need to actually let the weak bank fail or just give up. So that's how the ideal supervision or regulation of Japanese banks should be. So if you are part of it, well, good luck. But I think, but I think next time around, in the next kind of downturn, I think we will be facing kind of maybe if not wave, but then we will be facing some banks just giving up on their business, being merged by other banks. And how do I incorporate the analysis of banks? I don't really incorporate it. It's not, Japanese banks is not really important industry anymore. So, I mean, you know why? Because back in 1980s, on average, Japanese company had 4 times more debt than equity, which is to say, when you look at the company's balance sheet, 80% were financed by debt. So basically, bank had to keep lending them like 80% of the asset company owns. So it was very important that banks keeps credit flowing. But nowadays, the debt ratio has fallen to 1. So only 50% are debt and the 50% are equity. So I think in that sense, this financial intermediation matters less for Japan. So I think that's one reason why banks don't really matter. So bad debt, I don't think it matters that much to Japan.
Gilles Campagnolo, National Center for Scientific Research, France, and also a program about liberalization in the Eastern Asia for the European Union. One question that I will, 3 questions, but one is about this liberalism thing. You said you liked more the Koizumi style, but this style has much in common at the level of actual policies, maybe not in the image, but in the actual policy. what will be the impact of a change of situation like we have known recently towards some protectionism, especially from the United States and with tariffs and all that. So is this liberalism in the actual policy that's possibly kept on by Japan with TPP or not? Well, what about this meaning of liberalism in face of the new situation? First question. Second question, there is one word.
Economic liberalism.
Yeah, well, you said you're. One thing is that since you're talking macro, micro or theory doesn't really come in often, but
Okay.
still it's needed. For example, even when you spoke about the unemployed people, you came back to the figures of the actual households and the people who are actually living. So micro is also essential,
Okay.
actually. But so first for liberalism. Second is about this innovation, that the word that didn't appear at all. Whereas in your talk, whereas the other things like workforce, lack of workforce, problems at the micro level of employing the elder or women or robots, if not or so. So how far is this capacity of innovation able to face the challenges that are put at the micro level as well as the macro level?
Okay.
We had a special, in this program for the European Union, the Japanese consulate in Marseille, southern France, supported two conferences that I organized on innovation and competition, Japan and France. And innovation was the key word that the consulate wanted to put forth. But it didn't appear in your talk. So what about that?
Oh.
Yeah.
Okay.
Basically, that's it. Thanks.
I think innovation might be. Well, I would be very, very skeptical if a government official talk about innovation. You know, they are in a safe place with no risk of losing their jobs. And I'm always skeptical. So whenever I meet like government official preaching, you should innovate, you should leave your company and start up a new company, I tell them, why don't you do that, you know? So whenever government official talk about innovation, I think they don't really understand what they're talking about. Yes, innovation is important, but I don't think it comes out of government policy. I think it's actually, I would actually say it would do more harm if government start doing whatever they feel is good for innovation, because in the end, I think that would really harming, and they would rather just cut tax and innovate. But so that's innovation. So I mean, it's important, but then I think there's relatively little active policy. Japanese, public. So like at the beginning of Abenomics, they came out with, I think they spent like close to 300 billion yen giving out money to the people who start a company. From my subjective estimation, like 70% of that were wasted. You know, I think they were either spent fraudulently, or they just went to lawyers or accountants without really. So they should have rather spent that 300 billion just lowering tax. That would have been so much better for the innovation. As for the first question, liberalism, I think Japanese economy is actually fairly liberal already in terms of, so economic liberalism, like a free market. I think, so I mean, Japan Railway used to be a public company. Japan Tobacco used to be a public company. NTT used to be a public company, but they are now all in private hands. So I think Japan is already fairly liberalized from economic point of view, I think. Japanese banks, they are in private, but they are run by government. But so maybe Japanese banks.
And will remain so.
I think they, at some point, but then, back in 2000, I think there were like a huge number of elimination of banks because they were facing the reality. So I think when the next downturn comes, I think banks have to either go bankrupt or, get merged.
I'm Ken Moritsugu with the Associated Press. I wanted to ask you about stagnation. So for 2 decades plus, Japan has had fairly stagnant economy. But Japan has kind of survived, right? It hasn't been pretty, but it hasn't been,
Yeah.
it hasn't been ugly either,
Right.
Japan is surviving.
Yes.
And so I have 2 questions. One is, what is the likelihood of this stagnation to continue for another 20 years? If we met in 2035 or 2040, would we be having a similar conversation? And if that happened, can Japan survive as well 20 more years of stagnation, or is there some point at which it becomes a problem?
So I'm relatively pessimistic. I'm still relatively pessimistic about kind of a medium-term future of Japan. So medium-term saying like 10 years time. So I don't think Abe can finish this reflation. So I think, so in that sense, I think Japan, there's more chance that Japan would continue to stagnate for the next 10 years. And then I think at some point, I think some shock, economic shock, have to wake Japan up and eliminate a lot of banks. Maybe let Mizuho Bank go bankrupt, or I don't know, let one of trading companies go bankrupt, or let maybe not Toyota, but like we still have too many electronics company, I think, So sooner or later, I think economic force will kind of force Japan to change, but I don't see that. I don't see that Japan kind of soft landing and I don't know, growing. Unfortunately, but I'm happy to if there's actually if I may take a poll. How many of you agree with my statement I just made, that it is more likely that Japan will continue to stagnate for the next 10 years? ちょっと? Okay, how many of you don't agree with me in a positive way, that you feel that the worst period for Japan is over in the past, and Japan will start to, I don't know, be a better, I mean, so there has been 2 decades of stagnation. Who do you think, do you think it's going to be 3 decades of stagnation, or you feel that the 2 decades was actually enough and Japan will continue to grow? I mean, Japan will start to grow. Who you think? You are the optimistic guy. Two of you.
Depends on the proportion. And
That's a very...
It's not the prospect in long term, but for short-term periods, to some extent.
Thank you.
There's
If
also
it remains open.
there's the premise. You said there's a premise that Japan's been stagnating for 20 years.
Right.
Suppose I were to take issue with that. Suppose I were to say, well, it looks in an absolute sense that maybe Japan has been stagnating, but you look at Japan's performance relative to peers in Europe and the United States, you would argue that Japan has actually been more successful at adjusting to the challenges that an aging society poses than any of its peers. So is that stagnation? I'm not sure.
Right. So, but yes, of course, there are values we cannot measure in monetary term. So if you, I think if you start to include like non-monetary welfare, I think I might agree with your argument. But then if you just measure like per capita GDP, I still remember the day Japan was like second, only after like Liechtenstein. Japan had almost the highest per capita GDP in the past. In like, I don't know, 1990, 1991, when I was in high school, like reading, 1995. Yeah, but now Japan is like number 17, 18, somewhere there. Japan has lower per capita GDP than Singapore.
Just a question on that for a non-specialist. I thought it's very hard for a mature capitalist economy to break out of what you might call stagnation of 2%. to reach what Trump promises of 4%. I thought growth rates of 4% or more are characteristic of China, India, and developing countries. Is that not true?
Yeah, yeah. So I mean, even U.S. is not growing at the rate of 4%, but then Japan is. I think Japan's potential growth is like 0.5, maybe, yeah, 0.5. Yeah, but I think growth rate, overall growth rate is actually okay. I mean, Japan can keep growing at the rate of 0.5 because, population shrinking, working population shrinking even faster. But then, as a Japanese who go abroad a lot, I can actually see that the purchasing power of yen is weaker every year. Like, like nowadays, I can't really stay at the, especially because I run my own firm, I can't stay at the very nice hotel overseas. Whereas, in the better days, that I was able to stay at maybe not at Ritz-Carlton, but some, okay hotel and find it, payable. But so yeah, I think. Yeah, so I think Japan can do better.
Well, on this optimistic note, we reach the end. Thank you very much. I was very interested by your Keynesian point of view. I wonder, I will ask this in my last very short question since I control the microphone. To what extent intellectually do you think Keynes has an impact on the Abe policymakers? In other words, do they believe in what they're doing because they've read Keynes, they've read economic history, or is it just a conclusion they've reached empirically without having gone back to history and the classics of economics?
I don't think, so Abe is not known for his kind of scholarly intelligence. So, I mean, so I don't think he read Keynes. But I think this time around, I think he does have a certain ability, certain, I don't know, guts, judgment power. So I think his decision to call for dissolution of the lower house last year was just genius. I mean, it was fantastic as a politician, to protect himself. So I don't know why he decided to believe in 2% inflation, but then but it was a radical policy, and somebody told him, and a lot of politicians could have ignored that. But he somehow realized that's actually a way for him to go back to prime ministership and continue to rule Japan for 5 years. So I think probably he had a guts feeling. If not, sorry, he had a guts feeling rather than here.
Okay. Well, thanks. Actually, to be honest, I read Skidelsky. I didn't read the Keynes. But thanks again. Thank you so much, Tak. I'd like to thank Emily and Eriko. Well, they're not here. And I'd like to thank all the student workers. As you know, without them, we wouldn't be able to deliver these events. I'd like to thank all of you for coming, because what makes these sessions interesting is the speaker and the audience. So thanks again. Thank you, Tak.
Very much. Thank you. Thank you.
And we wish you all a very happy Golden Week. And there will be an exam on Keynes after Golden Week.